The night folds over the American Midwest with a quiet confidence, the land stretching wide beneath a fading sky, and the first breath of twilight carrying the soft weight of stories waiting to be told. It is a calm that feels deep yet inviting, steady enough to soothe but vivid enough to keep your mind gently awake. And in that calm, a familiar figure begins to take shape, moving into view with the slow certainty of a memory returning. The plains settle into stillness as long fields darken into muted gold. Wooden fences stretch like quiet lines across the landscape, and rivers bend with the unhurried grace of something that has seen countless seasons. A warm trace of dust drifts through the grasslands, as though the earth exhales after a long day beneath the sun. This is where Jesse James first appears, not with dramatic force, but with the soft rhythm of the frontier itself, shaped by time, distance, and choices that moved like gentle ripples across the years. Before legends found him, he was simply a young boy on a Missouri farm, waking to the creak of the barn door, the calls of early birds, and the steady footsteps of family moving through their morning routines. Summers brought warm breezes, winters brought crisp air, and life unfolded in small grounding tasks that carried the ease of familiar habit. These quiet beginnings formed the earliest threads of his story, woven from days that felt simple, steady, and full of ordinary motion. As you settle into your space, letting your shoulders release any remaining tension, imagine the world around him softening into evening light. The noise that once filled his life, marching boots, hurried voices, restless horses, fades into distant memory, leaving only the quieter details behind. A saddle resting on a fence post, a door gently opening to let morning in, the slow settling of dust along a country road. Tonight we follow his journey not through conflict, but through the softened echo of the past, as though viewing the world from a slow-moving carriage. At dusk, footsteps fall without urgency. The horizon glows with the last hint of day, and the frontier opens with a steady calm that invites you to drift just a little deeper into rest. The journey begins. Early years in a divided land. Missouri in the mid-1800s rested beneath a quilt of slow-moving winds and wide, unbroken skies. In this softened telling, the land feels like a quiet breath, stretching from river valleys to weathered barns leaning gently into the afternoon light. For young Jesse, these early days unfolded with the calm certainty of routines that rarely hurried. The low hum of insects in tall grass, the steady creak of porch boards, the whisper of fields touched by sunrise. Though the world beyond the farm trembled with disputes and shifting loyalties, the boy's earliest memories shimmered with simplicity. Family voices, the warm dust of familiar trails, and the soft comfort of a home held together by effort rather than abundance. His father's passing left a tender hush over the household, yet his mother's patient strength wrapped the family in a sense of continuity that quieted fear before it could grow. As seasons turned, Jesse learned the rhythm of rural life through tasks that shaped each day with steady purpose. He moved through fields that rippled like gentle waves, mended tools worn smooth by use, and helped care for horses whose calm breathing carried its own kind of reassurance. Nights were peaceful, marked by the flicker of oil lamps and the soft thud of boots set near the door. In these small rituals, Jesse felt the land teaching him patience, the kind that settles into one's bones and remains even when the world begins to shift. His bond with his siblings, Frank and Susan, grew strong through shared chores and quiet talks beside the barn, forming a foundation that would later steady him when certainty dissolved. By Jesse's mid-teens, the quiet edges of Missouri had begun to blur. Riders appeared more frequently on distant roads, their silhouettes crossing the horizon like warnings carried on horseback. Camps rose and disappeared, leaving faint traces in the grass. Conversations among neighbors lowered into tentative murmurs. The calm air seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Jesse and Frank heard whispers long before they fully understood them. Talk of loyalty, unrest, and choices that seemed far bigger than the boys who listened. Still, life tried to hold its familiar shape, even as its seams loosened. Frank reached the age to join a mounted group, stepping into a role shaped by the times more than by desire. Jesse watched him ride out, dust rising behind the horse like a fading ribbon. Too young to follow, he remained at the farm, but he listened to every story the older riders brought back, traveling through forests under moonlight, avoiding rough roads, and trusting one another in the face of uncertainty. These tales seeped into him slowly, like distant storms edging closer. When Jesse turned 16, the threshold arrived quietly. He joined a small mounted group, young men not much older than he was, all holding their own mixture of courage and hesitation. The world he entered was one of slow rides under pale dawns, careful signals exchanged with subtle gestures, and long stretches of watchfulness beneath trees that whispered with every breeze. Campfires became companions, their warmth gathering the tired bodies of riders who leaned on one another for steadiness. The tension around them softened in moments. The peaceful snort of horses settling, the glow of embers drifting upward, the shared quiet after a long day. Jesse learned these new rhythms gently. His instincts deepened as the land continued to guide him. River bends that signaled direction, shadows that revealed movement, shifts in wind that spoke of weather beyond sight. Books never taught him these things. The world itself became his teacher. He grew to understand the silence between sounds, the meaning within pauses, and the feel of unease before it fully surfaced. These lessons, simple yet profound, carved themselves into the way he carried his breath, held his reins, and trusted his steps. Through each challenge, Jesse held close the companionship of his group. They rode together, shared meals marked by laughter too tired to rise fully, and kept watch for one another on nights when the woods felt unfamiliar. This brotherhood, fragile yet sincere, steadied him more than any weapon or warning. Their youth knitted them together, giving shape to days that otherwise blurred into long trails and soft dread. When the official conflict finally loosened its grip, Jesse had already lived years that stretched far beyond his age. At 18, he returned home, carrying memories heavy with dust, smoke, and the quiet weight of things he would never fully recount. The Missouri he found was familiar yet altered. Roads traced by new travelers, barns bearing different signs, and landscapes touched subtly by change. Places he once knew now held silence where voices used to be, and the soft-spoken calm of his childhood felt like something reached only in memory. As he settled again into farm life, Jesse discovered that returning was not the same as going back. The routines were familiar, yet he moved through them with a newfound steadiness shaped by years on horseback and nights spent reading the land like a quiet map. His mother noticed the subtle changes, the way he paused before speaking, the way he scanned horizons even during peaceful tasks, the way his hands carried both caution and calm. The farm had endured, but it too bore marks of the shifting era. Fences repaired by new neighbors, fields adjusted after seasons of uncertainty, and paths once worn by friends who had long since moved on. Jesse's step blended into this changed world with gentle acceptance, carrying neither bitterness nor fear, only the sense that life continued, its slow, patient turning. In the months that followed, Jesse rebuilt connections with the land as though reacquainting himself with an old friend. He rose before dawn to listen to the soft chorus of morning birds, feeling the cool breath of early light against his skin. Working the soil became a grounding act, the steady motion of planting and tending, easing the weight of memories he carried. Horses, once companions, intense journeys, now became symbols of calm as he brushed their manes and led them through pastures washed in golden haze. Evenings brought a quiet kind of peace, lamps glowing gently against wooden walls, Susan humming as she worked, and Frank returning occasionally with stories that drifted like fading echoes. These moments reminded Jesse that healing came not from forgetting, but from allowing the land to speak softly enough to soothe what had hardened inside him. Yet not all was stillness. Missouri, shaped by its own history of shifting loyalties, continued to evolve around him. Travelers arrived at nearby towns, sharing accounts of rebuilding efforts, new alliances, and families searching for steadier ground. Markets hummed with low conversation, and the roads, once uncertain, began to fill with a cautious but hopeful movement. Jesse observed these changes with thoughtful calm, understanding more deeply than before how quickly landscapes could transform. The years of conflict had sharpened his awareness, teaching him to notice the difference between tension and simple noise, between risk and change. He became someone who listened first, acted second, and trusted the quiet instincts the land had etched into him. Through all this, Jesse also grew into a role within his community, not as a leader by declaration, but as a steady presence whose calm earned quiet respect. Neighbors sought his help with tasks requiring patience, from guiding young riders to repairing tools with careful precision. Jesse never spoke of himself as someone shaped by extraordinary events. Instead, he framed his experiences as lessons learned from movement, hardship, and the companionship of those who rode beside him. His humility allowed others to see in him a reflection of their own endurance, a reminder that even in divided times, resilience could take root in ordinary lives shaped by steady hands and quiet hearts. As seasons continued to pass, Jesse shaped a future that blended childhood warmth with the steadiness earned from difficult years. He moved through each day with quiet purpose, letting the land guide him back into its familiar rhythm. The fields, the horses, and the slow breath of Missouri welcomed him gently, helping him settle into a life no longer defined by conflict. In this peaceful return, Jesse carried a calm understanding of resilience, letting each new day remind him that strength could grow quietly without urgency. In this way, he learned that even small, steady choices could shape a life with lasting peace. The first steps onto the outlaw trail. When When Jesse returned to his family farm, the world felt both familiar and strangely distant, as though the land itself had aged in ways he could not fully name. The same wooden porch welcomed him each morning. The same fields stretched beneath the horizon in long, quiet waves of green and gold. But something within the atmosphere had shifted. The farm had endured the passing years with patient resilience, yet subtle signs of change lingered in its stillness. Fences repaired too often, paths altered by new travelers, and neighbors carrying stories shaped by the upheavals that had swept through Missouri. Jesse sensed these changes the way a rider senses shifts in the wind. He and Frank tried to settle back into ordinary life, performing the chores they had once memorized through repetition, carrying water from the well, tending the horses, and walking the familiar distance from the barn to the house with feed sacks balanced on their shoulders. But peace moved at a slower pace than they remembered, and after years of intensity and motion, silence carried a weight that was difficult to set down. Work was hard to find in the unsettled months that followed. The region's shifting authority made life unpredictable, and many families struggled to rebuild properties that had been damaged or abandoned during conflict. Jesse felt restlessness rise quietly within him, not out of impatience, but from the lingering habits formed by his teenage years, listening for distant riders, watching the edges of fields for movement, waking before dawn with a sense of unfinished business. Even when he tried to keep his attention on the farm, part of his mind drifted toward the long roads beyond the hills, wondering what paths were opening, what opportunities lay hidden, and which old companions might be nearby. It was during this uncertain time that Jesse began meeting again with several former riders from the past. Their gatherings took place in quiet barns, empty fields, or the back rooms of local establishments where voices stayed low and conversations carried the weight of shared history. They spoke about the difficulties that ordinary people faced, lost property, changes in land ownership, shifting legal decisions, and the general unease of rebuilding a life when the ground beneath them felt unsteady. As they talked, frustrations surfaced in soft admissions rather than angry outbursts. Many believed that institutions meant to protect the region had become distant and impersonal. Banks in particular were seen as symbols of the shifting order, holding funds that seemed disconnected from the people who needed support the most. These discussions gradually shaped a new idea, one that arose not from ambition but from the blend of frustration, survival instinct, and the practical methods the young men understood best. They knew how to move quietly, how to read a town's rhythm, how to act decisively before confusion could gather. And so, almost naturally, a thought emerged. If the banks held the wealth that had once belonged to local families, perhaps those institutions could be approached in a more direct way, without petitions, paperwork, or the slow processes that rarely reached ordinary people. This idea, once spoken, moved through the group like a gentle current, gaining shape not through pressure, but through mutual recognition. Early in 1866, Jesse and a few riders, including his old friend Archie, formed a loose plan. It was simple in design and direct in execution. They would enter a bank during daylight, take what they could carry, and leave before anyone had time to respond. Banks in small towns were not heavily guarded, and such actions were nearly unimaginable during peaceful times. The simplicity of the plan appealed to Jesse's instinct for clarity. Approach steadily, avoid unnecessary noise, and step back into the open world. before confusion hardened into pursuit. On a mild February day, they carried out their first attempt. The town was peaceful, its streets lightly populated, and the bank rested in the soft quiet of early afternoon. Jesse and the others entered with calm steps, their movements measured rather than frantic. Inside, the atmosphere was still, as though the walls themselves expected nothing unusual. The group gathered the money with steady hands and left with the same quiet they had carried in. Only after they had ridden far from the town did the realization settle. The act had been completed before anyone fully understood what had happened. It moved through the community like a gust of unexpected wind, felt briefly, then chased by questions. For Jesse, the experience did not feel like a dramatic turning point. Instead, it felt like a continuation of skills he already possessed, moving efficiently, reading the environment with careful attention, and acting decisively when the moment demanded clarity. But the world noticed. Newspapers later recorded the event as one of the earliest daylight bank robberies during peacetime in the region, a label that Jesse never sought, but could not easily avoid. That single moment marked the beginning of a path that would gradually carry him outside the boundaries of the law, shaping the identity that history would one day remember. In the months that followed, Jesse and the group repeated their efforts. Their operations were not driven by reckless impulse, but by a calm structure shaped by experience. They selected targets with care, choosing small towns and crossroads where responses would be slow and recognition unlikely. Each event followed a similar pattern: arrive quietly, act swiftly, and vanish before attention could gather. They avoided unnecessary harm, moving with a sense of restraint that seemed to guide their decisions. Jesse, with his ability to observe details others overlooked, became an anchor within the group. He understood the timing of small towns, the flow of people through markets, and the subtle ways a community responded to unexpected events. His presence allowed the group to move with greater confidence, navigating narrow escapes and long, winding roads across state lines. Even amid these tense ventures, the group found peaceful intervals that softened their days. They camped in quiet valleys, where the grass swayed in slow rhythms, shared meals beneath open skies, and rested beside streams whose gentle sound erased the weight of recent risks. Their horses, steady companions through each journey, became symbols of calm, grazing in tall meadows, untouched by the urgency of human concerns. On long rides, the sound of hooves on dirt roads blended with the rustle of leaves overhead, creating moments where the world felt broader, safer, and free from the constraints of law or pursuit. These small fragments of serenity balanced the intensity of their actions, giving the riders a sense of continuity that helped them remain steady through uncertainty. As their reputation grew, newspapers began printing their names with increasing frequency. Some accounts described the group with bold admiration, painting them as daring figures, challenging authority. Others expressed concern, warning of the dangers posed by young men operating outside legal boundaries. Jesse read these articles occasionally, more curious than affected, but he rarely discussed them. To him, the stories felt distant from the quiet planning and steady decisions that shaped their daily life. He thought less of fame or notoriety and more of the immediate tasks, mapping routes, watching for danger, and guiding the group through small towns without leaving traces. By late 1866, the group's efforts had taken on a momentum that neither Jesse nor his companions could fully slow. What had begun as a short-term attempt to address local frustrations had grown into something larger, shaped by necessity, opportunity, and the unfolding stories that surrounded them. People spoke their names in distant towns, lawmen began following faint trails, and each new event carried both risk and recognition. Through it all, Jesse remained calm, stepping into his role with the same steadiness that had guided him since his youth. The outlaw trail had opened before him, not through sudden dramatic choice, but through a series of small steps shaped by circumstance, environment, and the quiet instincts he trusted. In this way, Jesse's life shifted steadily into a new rhythm, one defined by long rides, careful planning, and a sense of direction shaped by both necessity and the paths already behind him. The world had changed, and Jesse changed with it, stepping deeper into the uncertain road that would eventually define his legend. The rise of the James Younger Gang. As the seasons passed across Missouri's changing landscape, Jesse James saw his small group of riders quietly expand into something larger, steadier, and far more organized. Men who had shared long rides and tense nights during earlier years began returning. Cole Younger, Jim Younger, Bob Younger, and several others, whose experiences and instincts aligned naturally with Jesse's. They did not form a gang through loud declaration or formal agreement. Instead, through repeated cooperation, shared skills, and familiar trust, they became known among locals as the James Younger Gang, a title whispered more often than spoken openly. Their presence grew slowly, shaped by the rhythm of the land, the shifting times, and the practical understanding that they worked better together than apart. With their increasing numbers came new possibilities. Trains, once symbols of expanding industry and steady progress, soon appeared to the group as opportunities threaded along predictable routes. These steam-driven machines carried express safes, valuable shipments, and on occasion passengers who traveled with money and goods worth taking. But trains also brought challenges: tighter security near certain towns, regular schedules that could work against them, and the need for precise coordination. For a group skilled in navigating rough terrain, reading landscapes, and planning quietly, the railroads represented both opportunity and risk. Jesse and his companions approached them with caution, studying each potential route as carefully as a farmer examines the sky before planting. Before any operation, the gang walked the tracks for days at a time. They observed the bends and slopes, listening to the distant hum of locomotives as they moved through the countryside. They discovered how certain stretches of the rail line forced the trains to slow, and how others allowed them to gather speed. They hid in the shade of oak groves or in the tall grass along creek beds, watching trains pass, counting the number of cars, noting the placement of guards, and learning the patterns of the conductors. Nothing was rushed. Every detail mattered, for the group preferred quiet precision over reckless speed. Their first major train operation occurred on a warm, summer evening when the air seemed to hold its breath, suspended in stillness as though waiting for the night's events. The gang prepared their tools and positioned themselves along a curve where the train's momentum naturally eased. Their horses stood tied among thick trees, ready to move at a moment's notice but calm in the familiar presence of their riders. When the train approached, its steady rhythm built slowly, a deep mechanical breathing that grew louder with each passing second. The brief interruption that followed was marked not by chaos but by deliberate, controlled motion. The gang boarded the train, opened the safe, collected what they sought, and reassured passengers in calm tones that kept fear from spreading. Then, as quickly as they arrived, they disappeared into the woods before any organized response could form. This pattern defined their operations in the months and years that followed. The gang moved swiftly but never with unnecessary violence. Their instructions were clear, their actions measured, and their goal always to complete the task with minimal disruption. They rarely stayed together after an operation. Instead, they separated into smaller groups, traveling back roads, wooded paths, and winding trails before meeting again at pre-arranged locations known only to members of the gang. Such habits kept them difficult to track and gave each rider space to move without drawing attention. Yet despite the seriousness of their endeavors, the gang's daily life was far from constant tension. Most days were spent tending to horses, securing meals at out-of-the-way farms, or resting beside quiet streams where the water moved slowly over smooth stones. These peaceful intervals balanced the intensity of their tasks, reminding each man that life still offered calm moments between long rides. In the evenings, they sometimes shared stories or traded gentle jokes, leaning back against saddlebags or fallen logs while the sun dipped behind distant hills. These times did not erase the risks ahead, but they brought steady comfort to men who lived mostly on the move. The gang's coordination sharpened with each operation. Jesse often led the planning, but the group functioned like a woven fabric, each member contributing knowledge, experience, and quick judgment. Signals became instinctive. If one rider raised a hand or shifted position, others responded without words. Their trust in one another grew not from titles or hierarchy, but from the shared reality that each man depended on the others to return safely from every task. Jesse's calm presence guided their decisions. He watched the land with the eye of someone who had grown up riding through fields, forests, and river valleys, attuned to subtle changes in weather, shadows, and sound. His understanding of the region shaped their strategies, allowing them to anticipate dangers before they appeared. As months became years, the James Younger gang became a familiar name across the region. Newspapers followed their activities with fascination, though often with incomplete or embellished accounts. Some stories portrayed them as daring figures, challenging institutions seen as distant and powerful. Others emphasized their unlawful acts, describing them as remnants of earlier turmoil who chose a path outside the law. These portrayals shifted from county to county, but none fully captured the quiet, methodical nature of their operations. For the gang itself, such stories felt distant from the everyday reality of planning routes, maintaining equipment, and navigating past towns without drawing notice. Local lawmen began tracking their movements with increasing determination, though communication systems of the time limited how quickly information could spread. Riders attempting to follow the gang's trail often found abandoned campsites, weeks-old hoof prints, or vague rumors from travelers who may or may not have recognized the men they spoke of. Even when authorities organized larger responses, the gang's ability to read the land allowed them to slip away before risk grew too great. Yet beneath this outward success, subtle changes began forming. The gang's operations, though still smooth, encountered occasional complications. Law enforcement became more organized. Towns adjusted to stories of train robberies by strengthening watch groups or adding guards. The public, while still captivated, grew increasingly divided in its perception of the gang. Some admired their confidence, others believed they threatened the fragile stability of the recovering region. Even within the gang, a quiet awareness formed that each new operation carried more risk than the last. Still, the men continued. The rhythm they had built over the years carried them forward, shaped by routine, trust, and familiarity. They rode through broad fields that stretched beneath enormous Midwestern skies, crossed creeks swollen by spring rains, and traveled along ridges where the wind whistled softly through the grass. The land remained both refuge and guide, offering countless places to rest, hide, or regroup. Jesse relied on this closeness to the environment, adjusting plans when storms rolled in or when roads became too traveled. His calm decision-making helped steady the group even as the landscape around them slowly transformed. The gang's ability to adapt kept them ahead of pursuit longer than many expected. But the shifting environment, growing telegraph lines, more coordinated sheriffs, and towns prepared for unexpected intrusions, created new pressures. What had once felt like open country now carried hints of confinement. And though the gang still trusted their skills, each man sensed that the world around them was changing. By the time these subtle tensions fully surfaced, the James Younger gang had already left a significant mark on the region. Their name traveled farther than the riders themselves, carried by train conductors, merchants, travelers, and newspaper columns that spread stories faster than horses could run. But for the gang, daily life remained grounded in simple tasks: grooming horses, repairing gear, mapping routes, and planning each new operation with deliberate care. They did not dwell on the growing attention. They simply continued moving, trusting their instincts and one another. In this way, the James Younger gang rose quietly, shaped not by dramatic declarations but by consistent decisions, steady cooperation, and the careful reading of landscapes both physical and social. Their story in these years was one of motion, risk, and resilience, a path chosen step by step, shaped by changing times and the riders who moved through them with practiced calm. The turning point, Northfield and the long escape. The summer of 1876 carried the James Younger gang into unfamiliar territory, drawing them farther north than their usual trails and into landscapes shaped by wide plains, cool breezes, and towns that seemed untouched by the tensions moving quietly across the country. Their destination, the small town of Northfield, Minnesota, rested gently among rolling hills and modest streets, a place where local life moved at an unhurried pace. To the gang, the town appeared peaceful, almost serene, yet its quiet demeanor was part of what made it appealing. It suggested predictability, routine, and a rhythm the gang believed they could move within without causing alarm. For Jesse, the journey north held a sense of purpose, though not with any sense of grandeur. It was simply the next step in a long sequence of decisions shaped by experience and instinct. The planning for the Northfield job unfolded slowly, shaped by the gang's usual pattern of patient observation and careful division of labor. They chose to enter the town in smaller teams, blending into the surroundings rather than arriving as a single large group. Jesse, Frank, and Bob would enter the bank. Cole and Jim Younger would manage the area outside, watching for changes in the atmosphere. The remaining riders formed a third group responsible for maintaining the escape route. It was a plan built with a calm confidence, one that followed the same structure that had carried them through years of previous operations. They expected the town's routine to work in their favor, offering them enough space to move without drawing immediate attention. When the day arrived, the air carried a crisp, refreshing coolness typical of northern summers. The sky stretched wide and clear, and the streets of Northfield were dotted with townspeople engaged in their everyday tasks. Shopkeepers arranged goods near their doors. Farmers brought produce in from the edges of town. Neighbors exchanged greetings as they passed one another near the general store or bakery. To an outside observer, the scene held nothing unusual. Even the arrival of unfamiliar riders caused no immediate concern, for travelers passed through the area often enough to avoid suspicion. Jesse and the others moved with steady, relaxed steps, becoming momentary participants in the town's familiar rhythm. Inside the bank, the atmosphere felt gentle and orderly. Clerks worked quietly at their desks, sorting papers, recording accounts, and handling small transactions for local residents. When Jesse, Frank, and Bob entered, the staff initially responded with polite attentiveness. But the tone shifted subtly when the men requested access to the safe. The bank employees hesitated, explaining certain limitations, and the seconds stretched longer than expected. What began as a routine moment transformed into a slow tightening of tension. Outside, residents started noticing the unfamiliar horses and riders lingering near the building, their presence enough to break the town's usual pattern. People began whispering to one another, glancing toward the bank with curiosity that quickly grew sharper. The peaceful rhythm of Northfield, so comforting in its predictability, became the very force that disrupted the gang's careful timing. The residents' instincts worked against the plan. The group inside struggled to move the operation forward. The group outside watched the steadily increasing crowd. Movements gained urgency, not from intention, but from reaction. And soon the town, which had moments earlier been a picture of calm, found itself caught between confusion and instinctive defense. When shots were fired, they came not from a calculated confrontation, but from the collision of fear, surprise, and sudden motion. The gang, realizing the situation had changed irreversibly, pulled back. Their retreat was not frantic but swift, shaped by years of practiced coordination. They regrouped beyond the town's immediate outskirts and began what would become one of the most challenging escapes of their lives. The once simple plan had transformed into a long, complicated journey that stretched across fields, rivers, and dense patches of forest. Their movements grew quiet and deliberate, shaped by caution rather than speed. Their survival depended not on confrontation but on endurance. The days that followed tested the gang in ways they had rarely experienced. The terrain in Minnesota differed from the familiar landscapes of Missouri and surrounding states. Narrow trails twisted between marshes, rocky ridges, and thick stands of trees. Weather shifted unpredictably. Nights came cool and long, with winds that pushed through branches and grasses with a soft insistence. The gang traveled steadily, but injuries sustained in Northfield made progress difficult. Some members struggled to maintain pace. Others carried burdens that weighed more heavily with each passing hour. The unity that had defined their earlier movements now wavered under the stress of fatigue, pain, and increasing distance from one another. Eventually, the group fragmented into smaller sections, not by intention but by necessity. Jesse and Frank separated from the others, believing the split would increase everyone's chances of escape. Their departure carried no ceremony. It was a decision made in quiet recognition of what the moment required. The remaining members continued on for as long as their strength allowed, navigating unfamiliar land by watching the stars, reading the rivers, and listening for distant sounds that might reveal pursuit. They pressed forward, sustained by determination rather than urgency, knowing each mile placed them farther from the streets of Northfield. Some reached temporary safety. Others, slowed by injury or exhaustion, were eventually captured. Each outcome reflected the varied paths they had taken through the landscape, but all of them traveled astonishing distances before their journeys ended, propelled less by desperation than by an unwavering commitment to move forward. Their escape became one of the most widely discussed events associated with the gang, but for the men living through it, it felt more like an extended stretch of survival. Long days of walking, long nights of listening, and long hours of choosing the next direction in silence. For Jesse and Frank, the escape concluded far from Minnesota, in quieter regions where the pace of local life resembled the calmer days they once knew. They blended into these new environments with careful ease, observing routines, adapting to small-town rhythms, and avoiding unnecessary attention. While the nation discussed Northfield with fascination or criticism, the brothers lived through the aftermath in subdued moments, reflecting not on the event itself, but on the path that had unfolded afterward. They did not frame the experience as a tragedy or a turning point. Instead, it became a stretch of their journey, defined by patience, endurance, and the instinct to keep moving. Yet Northfield undeniably became a turning point in the gang's wider story. Their numbers had diminished. Their coordinated structure had weakened. The ease with which they once traveled now carried new weight. The roads they rode felt changed, not physically, but in meaning. The confidence that had guided earlier seasons no longer felt effortless. Instead, a quiet recognition emerged. The world around them had shifted. The responses to their operations grew stronger, the risks sharper, and the landscape less forgiving. Though Jesse and Frank continued onward, they did so with an awareness that the path ahead held different challenges than the ones they had faced before. Still, they moved forward, adaptable, steady, and guided by the same instinct that had carried them since their earliest days. Northfield had altered the course of their journey, but it had not ended it. The brothers learned to read new surroundings, find new allies, and navigate unfamiliar towns where their names were not yet spoken. They adjusted with calm resilience, preparing for whatever new chapter awaited them, not through ambition or expectation, but through the quiet acceptance that movement, more than anything else, had always been their way of surviving. A quieter life and new companions. When the long escape from Minnesota finally faded into memory, Jesse and Frank settled into the gentler landscapes of Tennessee, a place where hills rolled softly into one another and towns carried the calm rhythm of ordinary life. Under assumed names, they stepped into a quieter existence. Jesse became Thomas Howard, a man who spoke in measured tones, moved with deliberate care, and allowed the world around him to unfold without hurry. Frank, more naturally inclined toward peaceful routines, found comfort in the change almost immediately, embracing the softened pace of daily tasks and the friendly nature of local communities. Life in Tennessee carried a steady simplicity that neither brother had experienced in many years. They cared for their families, tended small duties, and took part in local gatherings where neighbors greeted one another with easy familiarity. Evenings were especially calm. The sun would set across fields of muted gold, leaving behind a soft glow that drifted into their homes. Lamps lit gently, conversation remained warm and unforced, and the brothers learned for a time to rest in lives that asked little of them. Frank adapted well, folding himself naturally into the routines of home and community. Jesse, however, carried a quiet restlessness within him, like a faint current beneath still water. It did not disturb his daily movements, but it never fully disappeared. As weeks became months, the peaceful rhythm attracted occasional visitors, travelers passing through, farmers seeking assistance, and men who carried whispers of stories from Missouri. Some came out of curiosity, hoping to glimpse the figures whose names lingered in distant conversations. Others sought opportunity, imagining that the calm setting disguised a deeper history they wished to share or revive. And in this slow gathering of new faces, Jesse found himself gradually drawn back toward familiar patterns, not through intention, but through the natural pull of those who looked to him for guidance. It was during this period that a number of younger riders appeared, men who had not crossed the old trails with the James Younger gang, men whose understanding of Jesse came from stories rather than shared experience. They admired him, treated him with respect, and followed his words with attentive eagerness. Yet despite their loyalty, they lacked the deep-rooted connection he once shared with Frank, Cole, Jim, Bob Younger, and the early companions who had shaped the long years of movement and decision-making. The newcomers did not understand the subtle signals exchanged with a glance, the quiet instincts that guided timing, or the unspoken trust forged over countless miles. Jesse recognized this difference immediately, adjusting his expectations and taking on the role of patient mentor when needed. With these new companions, Jesse eased back into small operations. Nothing elaborate, nothing that disturbed the quiet nature of their surroundings, just simple tasks where careful planning met gentle execution. Tennessee's countryside provided new paths, shaded by dense forests, shaped by winding streams, and crossed by roads that felt both familiar and fresh. The group worked with cautious coordination, though their unity lacked the deep cohesion of earlier years. Often, after a day's ride or planning session, Jesse found himself sitting quietly under the evening sky, listening to the soft rustling of trees. In those hours, he would remember the old days, campfires glowing in remote clearings, horses resting under starlight, the steady presence of the Youngers, and the silent understanding he once shared so naturally with Frank. Still, life in Tennessee offered him a balance he had not known before. He spent time with his children, teaching them small tasks, carrying them across the yard, listening to their laughter echo through the house. Family meals became grounding moments, where voices blended gently and conversations drifted between small concerns and warm recollections. Jesse walked the land often, tracing the edges of fields, stepping along narrow paths and finding calm in the landscapes that shaped his days. For a while, both worlds, family and quiet outlaw work, coexisted around him, forming a delicate duality that allowed him to continue without feeling pulled entirely toward one direction or the other. Occasionally, Jesse joined friends for long rides under the soft light of the moon. These nights carried a sense of serenity that felt like a distant echo of his younger years. The group would travel across open fields and over low hills, the cool night air brushing past them as they spoke in quiet tones. Conversations flowed easily, stories shared, small jokes exchanged, reflections whispered without urgency. These rides offered a rare peace, moments where the tension of earlier times dissolved into a gentle sense of motion. Yet the world outside Tennessee was changing. Communication between towns grew faster, and news traveled more efficiently through expanding networks. Conversations in nearby communities shifted subtly, carrying hints of recognition or speculation. Travelers brought fragments of information that suggested attention was beginning to concentrate again, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. Jesse sensed these changes, not through explicit warnings, but through the intuitive awareness that had guided him for so many years. He understood how landscapes shifted, how patterns in people's behavior revealed unspoken truths, and how small signs often marked larger movements forming in the distance. Despite these shifts, Jesse moved through each day with steady composure. He trusted his instincts: observe, adapt, continue onward. It was the same approach that had brought him through years of uncertainty, across states and seasons, through harsh escapes and brief stretches of calm. His resilience did not rely on force, but on attentiveness, patience, and an inner steadiness that allowed him to adjust without losing direction. During this period, Jesse grew particularly close to two young brothers, Charlie and Robert Ford. They were polite, responsive, and consistently eager to prove themselves. Their youth made them energetic, and their admiration for Jesse made them loyal. The Ford brothers accompanied him on rides, helped in planning sessions, and listened intently to his instructions. Jesse appreciated their reliability, valuing the steadiness they brought during moments that required careful execution. He welcomed them into his home, allowed them to share meals with his family, and began to see them as trusted members of his circle. Yet beneath their calm expressions, a different set of intentions gradually formed. Intentions shaped partly by opportunity, partly by ambition, and partly by the complex stories circulating beyond the quiet rooms of Jesse's Tennessee home. Jesse did not sense the full extent of these shifting currents. He observed small hesitations at times, noticed quiet exchanges, but attributed them to inexperience or uncertainty. His nature leaned toward giving trust, slowly but firmly, and once given, he rarely revisited it with suspicion. As the seasons passed, Jesse's life unfolded in the steady blend of family moments, quiet planning, evening rides, and soft reflections. The peaceful surroundings, the gentleness of local routines, and the presence of young companions created a world that seemed balanced on a thin but stable edge. Even the subtle tightening of attention across the region did not break the surface calm of his days. He lived with a sense of practiced awareness, believing that the quiet patterns he shaped in Tennessee could continue as long as he moved with care. But the presence of the Ford brothers, loyal on the surface, shifting beneath, marked a silent turning in his story. Their growing influence, their desire for recognition, and the complexities forming beneath their companionship would eventually align with forces beyond Jesse's control. These subtle currents, still hidden beneath the calmness of daily life, would meet his path in a gentle yet irreversible way. For now, though, Jesse lived in the quiet middle ground between who he had been and who he was becoming. A man shaped by motion but learning to appreciate stillness. A father grounded by family but accompanied by riders who looked to him for guidance. And in this delicate balance, he continued forward, unaware that the final chapter of his journey was quietly approaching. The Final Days of Jesse James. By the early months of 1882, Jesse James, living quietly under the name Thomas Howard, had settled into a modest house along Lafayette Street in St. Joseph, Missouri, a home marked by its simple wooden structure, soft morning light, and an atmosphere of calm entirely different from the wide, unpredictable countryside he had once known. The neighborhood that surrounded it was peaceful in a way that almost felt unfamiliar to him. Children passed along the dusty road with small books tucked under their arms, neighbors exchanged brief greetings over fences, and dogs barked lazily at the slow movement of wagons rattling past. Inside the house, Jesse carried himself with the gentle routines of a man who had spent years listening for distant hoofbeats, but who now found himself hearing only the rustle of curtains stirred by the spring breeze. Every gesture he made was careful, each step measured, as though the habit of watchfulness had softened into a quieter form of awareness. He tended to simple tasks in the morning, checking the latch on a window, looking over the fence line in the yard, adjusting the position of tools in the shed, not out of nervousness, but out of a lifelong instinct to keep his world in order, to settle the small things before the day unfolded further. The Ford brothers, Charlie and Robert, were frequent figures in this space, moving in and out of the home with the familiarity of trusted companions. Charlie carried an easygoing manner, often humming to himself as he completed the tasks Jesse assigned, while Robert seemed more observant, speaking less but watching closely whenever Jesse explained something. In the quiet hours after sunset, the three of them sometimes gathered in the small parlor where the lamplight softened the room's edges, casting gentle shapes across the wallpaper. Their conversations were rarely dramatic. They spoke of errands, of neighbors, of small plans that seemed harmless, a delivery here, a potential trip there, nothing that suggested the weight of history, nothing that hinted at the deep tension forming quietly beneath the surface. Jesse found a kind of calm in these moments, a calm built from routine rather than certainty, from repetition rather than rest. The early days of April arrived with a mild gentleness. The air carried the soft scent of warming earth, and the faint green of new leaves shimmered in patches along the edges of the neighborhood. April 3rd began as one of those mornings where the sky seemed unusually steady, the kind of morning in which Jesse felt he could breathe without thinking about the past or the unmarked paths ahead. Breakfast that day consisted of simple fare, eggs, bread, and coffee, and the three men shared the meal with unhurried ease. Their conversation drifted through ordinary subjects: a planned trip south, the need to repair a saddle strap, a neighbor who had recently moved away. Jesse spoke in a calm tone, his voice steady and warm, and the Ford brothers responded in a way that made the room feel settled, almost domestic. Nothing in their speech or manner hinted at the turning point approaching. Nothing suggested that the quiet rhythm of the morning carried more significance than the countless mornings that had come before. After breakfast, Jesse rose from the table and walked into the main room, where sunlight fell across the floor in soft rectangles. The house was peaceful, holding that late morning stillness that always made Jesse pause for a moment, appreciating the gentle hum of life as it moved through open spaces. His eyes drifted along the walls, noticing small details: the neatly stacked papers on the desk, the coat hung carefully on the peg, and finally the picture frame that hung just slightly askew. It was a simple frame holding a simple image, but Jesse had always valued neatness in these small elements of daily surroundings. Perhaps it was habit. Perhaps it was a way of grounding himself in the present, or perhaps it was just the easiest thing to fix in a world where not everything could be adjusted so easily. Whatever the reason, the crooked frame caught his attention the way such things always had. He removed his coat, folding it gently over the arm of a nearby chair, and stepped toward the wall. His movements were slow, steady, almost meditative, reflecting the patient way he handled nearly all tasks in these later years. The house remained quiet behind him. No hurried steps, no clatter, no raised voices, just the soft presence of Charlie and Robert somewhere nearby, their footsteps faint against the wooden floorboards. As Jesse reached toward the frame, the moment seemed to lengthen, stretching out like a deep breath, held just slightly longer than usual, a moment suspended between routine and something unnamed. The light against the wall glowed softly. Dust floated quietly in the air. Even the sounds of the neighborhood, wagons, footsteps, distant conversation, felt muted, as though the world had momentarily softened its edges. It was within that suspended quiet that the final thread of Jesse's long journey came to rest. The movement of his hand, the tilt of his head, the gentle concentration in his eyes. Each element belonged to a man who had lived through years of shifting landscapes, narrow escapes, heavy decisions, and long stretches of silence beneath open skies. His final act was not dramatic, not fierce, not shaped by the urgency that had once defined so much of his life. It was an entirely ordinary gesture, a man adjusting a picture frame in a modest house on a mild spring morning. And in that simplicity, there was a softness that seemed to echo through every chapter of his life. The quiet rides at dusk, the whispered conversations beside campfires, the steady companionship of horses moving through early morning mist, the gentle bonds formed with those who had traveled beside him. What followed happened swiftly, but in this retelling, the focus remains not on the incident itself, but on the stillness just before it. A stillness that belonged wholly to Jesse, to the man beneath the reputation, the man beneath the layers of story and rumor. It was a stillness shaped by the land he had crossed, the choices he had made, and the soft persistence of his desire for a quieter existence. For Jesse, the ending of his path did not unfold on a frontier road or in a hidden clearing beneath starlight. It arrived instead in a small room warmed by the sun, surrounded by the faint sounds of a neighborhood carrying on with its day. In that quiet room, in that pause between movement and memory, Jesse's long journey came gently to its close. The house that had sheltered his final months held the moment lightly, as though aware of the significance, but unwilling to disturb the softness of the ending. Outside, the wind continued its slow passage through the trees. Inside, the picture frame remained where he had intended it to be, straightened, balanced, quietly aligned, and the life of Jesse James, shaped by both turbulence and calm, by both fame and solitude, settled into its final place within the long tapestry of American memory, leaving behind not only the echoes of his actions, but also the enduring impression of a man who, in his last days, sought nothing more than a small measure of peace. Life on the quiet frontier roads. After years of shifting towns, narrow escapes, and quiet movements across the countryside, Jesse James settled into a rhythm that blended caution with an unexpected sense of familiarity, as though the frontier roads themselves had softened over time and welcomed him back, in the way an old friend might, with no questions asked and no urgency in its greeting. These roads, once filled with uncertainty and unpredictable moments, now stretched before him with a steady patience that felt almost comforting. He had traveled them in earlier years with tension in his shoulders and a constant readiness to change direction. But now he moved through them with a slow ease, learning to recognize the landmarks that belonged to this chapter of his life. Shallow creeks shimmering in early morning light, old barns leaning into the wind like tired companions, clusters of cottonwoods offering shade during heat-heavy afternoons. The landscape felt familiar, but not in a way that tied him to the past. Instead, it grounded him gently in the present, allowing him to breathe without searching for hidden paths or listening for distant hoofbeats. In these small details, Jesse found a quiet continuity, a space where routine settled around him like an old coat, worn and comfortable. Most of his days during this period began at dawn, when the air was still cool and the horizon glowed with the faint silver hue that signaled the start of a long, open day. Jesse rose with deliberate slowness, not from fatigue, but from a newfound appreciation for the peaceful rhythm of the mornings. He saddled his horse with practiced motions, checking each strap and adjusting each pack with the same precise care that had once guided him through far more dangerous moments. The sounds accompanying these preparations were soft and familiar. The creak of leather pulled tight, the gentle snort of the horse as it shifted its weight, the whisper of morning wind moving across tall grass. These were the quiet signals that the day had begun, and Jesse welcomed them with the kind of calm that comes only after years of learning to recognize the smallest cues of the world around him. He no longer hurried through these moments. Instead, he lingered, appreciating the softness in the routine and the steadiness it brought. Though Jesse often traveled alone during this chapter of his life, the solitude never felt heavy or isolating. Rather, it allowed him to move through the landscape at his own pace, adjusting his path whenever a stream beckoned him to stop or a ridge invited him to pause and look out over the rolling distance. He found himself stopping more often than he once would have, allowing his horse to drink while he watched deer emerge cautiously from the tree line or sat on grassy slopes, listening to the distant hum of insects. The land felt large yet comforting, stretched wide like an open canvas where each step carried him farther from the tension that had once shaped his earlier years. These wandering days offered him a sense of space, not just physical space, but space within himself, a quiet place untouched by the urgency of pursuit or the weight of decisions that once defined him. As the sky shifted from morning silver to midday blue, Jesse rode with a gentle awareness of everything around him, hearing the world with clarity, but without the sharp edge of past vigilance. Small towns along the frontier roads became soft landmarks in Jesse's wandering routine. He approached them not as destinations, but as places of gentle pause, where he could replenish supplies and observe the simple rhythms of everyday life without drawing attention. These towns greeted travelers with scenes of unhurried activity, storekeepers sweeping dust from their wooden porches at sunrise, cattle grazing lazily behind weathered fences, children crossing narrow paths with pails in hand as they carried out morning chores. Jesse, moving under his assumed name, blended into these moments with a quiet ease that made him nearly invisible among the steady patterns of daily life. He purchased grain, rope, or small tools with soft politeness, spoke respectfully to townsfolk, and nodded farewell without lingering. People remembered him only as a calm man with steady eyes, someone who moved gently through their space without disturbing it. In this anonymity, Jesse found a kind of peace, a temporary belonging that required no explanation and offered no demands. Nights on the road carried their own kind of gentle beauty. Jesse often camped beneath broad skies where the stars hung so low they seemed almost close enough to touch. He built small fires, their crackling warmth creating a soft bubble of light around him as the earth cooled steadily beneath the darkening sky. The sounds of the night, distant owls calling from the trees, the rustle of animals moving cautiously through brush, the whisper of wind stirring loose grass, formed a quiet rhythm that felt soothing rather than threatening. Jesse no longer planned elaborate routes or mapped the terrain with the sharp intensity that once guided him. Instead, he rested fully, allowing the familiar sounds and the steady darkness to ease the long hours. These nights became some of the calmest moments in this chapter of his life. Quiet spaces where he could sit with his thoughts and breathe slowly beneath a sky unburdened by memory. On certain evenings, his path intersected with that of other travelers, merchants moving their wagons toward distant markets, wandering musicians carrying worn instruments across the plains, families heading westward in search of new beginnings. These encounters were brief but warm, marked by shared food, light conversation, and the kind of fleeting camaraderie that travelers often find in the presence of strangers. Jesse valued these moments not because they held deep significance, but because they offered him a subtle sense of belonging. The road, for all its distance from his former life, still held room for simple human connection, and Jesse found comfort in these temporary communities formed around campfires, where no one asked for names, histories, or reasons for traveling. During this period, Jesse spent much of his time reflecting, not in heavy or burdened thoughts, but in soft, unhurried considerations that drifted in and out of his mind as naturally as the wind moved through tall grass. The weight he once carried felt lighter now, not because it had lifted entirely, but because time had stretched it thin, smoothing its sharper edges. He understood the landscapes better than ever. The rolling hills that signaled the shift from one region to another, the wide sky that changed its palette from pale dawn to burnished sunset, the quiet language of the land spoken through wind, soil, and open space. The frontier seemed to understand him in return, offering room to move without haste and space to settle without confinement. This mutual understanding created a delicate balance, a harmony between man and land that gave Jesse a rare sense of calm. The frontier roads shaped this chapter of his life into a long, peaceful journey, far removed from the noise of newspapers, the urgency of pursuit, and the tension of earlier years that had once defined his reputation. Instead of racing from horizon to horizon, Jesse traveled with a soft steadiness, letting each day unfold on its own terms. The roads did not ask him to hurry, and he did not ask them for direction. Their only expectation was that he continue forward with the same quiet presence that had come to characterize his movements. In this gentle movement between one horizon and the next, Jesse found something close to stillness, a soft echo of the life he might have lived if the world had taken a different shape. He discovered a quietness that allowed him to feel not chased, not restless, but simply present. These frontier roads, with their patient bends and unbroken stretches, became not the backdrop of escape, but the setting of a man settling slowly and softly into the last calm chapter of his wandering life. The soft unraveling of trust. As the later years of Jesse's life unfolded, the rhythm around him grew gentler, marked by soft mornings, unhurried conversations, and quiet movements through familiar rooms. Yet within this calm, the relationships that formed the center of his daily life slowly began to shift, as if threads that once held tightly were loosening with time. Jesse had weathered many seasons of change, and with each new companion, he approached the world with the same measured patience that had always guided him. But the companions of his final years, especially the Ford brothers, brought different currents into his days, currents that moved quietly and almost invisibly beneath the surface. Charlie and Robert Ford were younger than the riders Jesse had once known, far younger than Frank, Cole Younger, or the men he had trusted during earlier seasons of his life. The brothers carried a mixture of admiration and uncertainty that shaped their interactions with Jesse in ways that were subtle but persistent. They followed him closely, listened to his stories, and watched his movements with the attentiveness of students studying a teacher who rarely raised his voice but always commanded respect. Jesse, seeing their eagerness, guided them with calm instructions and gentle corrections, teaching them how to read a landscape, how to prepare for long rides, and how to move with quiet confidence through unfamiliar towns. Yet beneath their admiration, something more delicate began to take shape, particularly in Robert. He watched Jesse with an intensity that hovered between fascination and ambition, as if he were trying to understand not just Jesse's methods, but the structure of Jesse's life itself. He asked careful questions, observed every gesture, and held long silences that suggested deeper thoughts he rarely spoke aloud. At first, these moments held no weight. But as months passed, they formed a faint tension, one that Jesse sensed with the same instinct that had guided him through countless uncertain roads. Even with this growing tension, life in Jesse's household remained gentle. Many evenings saw the three men gathered around a quiet table, with lamplight softening the edges of the room. Jesse spoke calmly, reflecting on routes, supplies, or the timing of simple tasks. Charlie and Robert listened, sometimes adding their own thoughts, sometimes simply absorbing his words in the stillness of the room. Nights drifted by in easy rhythms, warm meals, quiet breaths, and small conversations that settled lightly in the air. The home felt safe, its rooms filled with a steady familiarity that Jesse cherished more than he admitted. But trust, even the softest kind, can change shape without announcing itself. Little by little, the Ford brothers began to carry new thoughts, new expectations, and silent pressures that moved them toward different directions. The world outside Jesse's home was shifting as well. Telegraph lines stretched farther, railroads connected towns more tightly, and news traveled with a speed that left less room for the slow, drifting life Jesse preferred. The outlaw world he once knew had grown smaller, not in distance but in the space it allowed for quiet movement. Responses were faster, risks less forgiving. Younger riders like the Fords felt these changes acutely. In this changing climate, the Ford brothers sometimes exchanged glances, short, quiet, thoughtful. Jesse noticed, not with suspicion, but with the calm understanding of a man who had spent much of his life reading not only landscapes, but the subtle movements of human nature. He recognized that their loyalties were not as deeply rooted as those of the older riders who had stood beside him in years past. But instead of confronting these shifts, he allowed them to settle naturally. Jesse had learned long ago that people rarely move in straight lines. Their paths bend, curve, and drift, shaped by forces they cannot always name. During this period, the rides they took together were smaller, simpler, and carried none of the intensity of earlier years. They traveled through open fields, past quiet barns, and along routes where the land stretched peacefully beneath wide skies. Sometimes they spoke softly as they rode. Other times they traveled in near silence, the sound of hooves steady against the earth. Jesse remained patient, guiding them without pressing, explaining without demanding, and offering a steady example rather than strict instruction. He understood that his own life had become a blend of caution and familiarity, and he accepted that younger companions might carry different expectations inside them. Yet even with this calm, something in the balance slowly shifted. Plans were discussed, but not carried out. Quiet hesitations entered conversations that had once flowed easily. The Ford brothers sometimes paused before responding, as if weighing not only their words but the consequences of their thoughts. Jesse sensed these hesitations, but he did not let them disturb the gentle routine he was shaping. He prepared meals with them, shared evenings in the same rooms, and moved through each day with the steady composure that had guided him through so many earlier crossroads. Trust, however, does not unravel loudly. It loosens in silence, in small looks, in moments of uncertainty, in unspoken questions that drift between companions sharing the same room. The soft unraveling of trust in Jesse's final season felt less like betrayal and more like the natural divergence of paths. Jesse walked a line shaped by reflection and quiet endurance. The Ford brothers, still young, walked lines shaped by their own fears, ambitions, and the pressures that gathered around them. In this sleep version telling of Jesse's final chapter, the emphasis rests not on tension or dramatic shifts, but on the gentle truth that human connections evolve in ways that are sometimes unnoticed until they settle into place. Jesse did not cling to trust with force. He accepted that relationships change like landscapes, influenced by time, distance, and the quiet currents within each person. He lived each day with a calm awareness, stepping lightly through moments that carry deeper meanings than any words spoken aloud. And so the final days before Jesse's closing chapter unfolded with an atmosphere of warmth and fragility. Meals shared beneath soft lamplight, conversations carried in low tones, careful movements through familiar rooms. Even as the threads of trust stretched thinner, the home remained peaceful, holding a quiet tenderness that shaped Jesse's final season. The unraveling happened gently, softly, almost with grace, and in the stillness of those moments, Jesse continued forward with the quiet acceptance that had always guided him. The quiet after the legend. After Jesse's passing, the stories that surrounded his life began to drift gently across the frontier, moving from one community to another like ripples expanding over a still pond, each retelling softening the sharp edges of memory and shaping him into a figure who belonged not only to history but also to the lingering imagination of the people who lived in the towns and landscapes he once crossed. Some spoke of him as a man formed by turbulent times, a figure who carried the weight of earlier conflicts in his quiet posture and measured movements. Others remembered him as a symbol of resistance, someone who moved outside the boundaries drawn by institutions that felt distant from everyday life. Many simply recalled him as a man whose journey, while extraordinary in moments, still held the familiar rhythms of family, weather, and long roads. Writers began to create tales based loosely on his actions, transforming small fragments of truth into fuller narratives, adding color where life had offered only shadow, and blending the real with the imagined until Jesse became something larger than any single version of himself. These stories traveled outward, told in homes, in saloons, in quiet gatherings, and eventually found their way into books, newspapers, and later forms of entertainment that preserved his memory in shifting, evolving forms. Travelers visited the towns he had once lived in, walked the porches where he had stood, and looked out over the landscapes that had shaped his days. Museums arose in modest homes, preserving objects that carried the lightest trace of his presence. An old chair, a window frame, a patch of wooden floor worn smooth by footsteps. These places did not glorify him. Instead, they offered quiet space for reflection, allowing visitors to imagine a life lived between movement and stillness. Over time, the legend softened further. The loudest moments of confrontation faded into the background, replaced by quieter memories. Jesse saddling a horse at dawn, sharing a simple meal with his family, or walking through a small town where no one recognized him. His life became less about tension and more about the landscapes he crossed, the people he knew, and the gentle way memories settle when enough years have passed. As the decades moved on, the frontier itself changed. Roads widened, towns grew, and the open plains that once stretched without interruption began filling with new generations who knew Jesse only through stories passed down like folded maps of distant days. Yet in these stories, he remained a soft presence, a reminder of how history can be both restless and quiet at once. In this gentle closing, Jesse's story becomes not a tale of conflict, but a meditation on time, memory, and the calm that follows after movement. And as you drift toward rest, let the wide plains, slow rivers, and quiet towns of his world fade softly, settling like dusk, giving way to night. The story has finished its long journey. You may rest now,